Neil, it's so great to see you this morning and to have you on my podcast, Psyche. I'm really excited about getting this chance to know you better and to explore some of the work you've done, thinking about Erich Fromm and then Jordan Peterson and how they connect and the ways that they're different. And yeah, I'm just super excited about this conversation and look forward to see where it goes.
Thrilled to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah. Okay. So, Neil, would you start by just maybe giving the listeners a sense of kind of who you are and kind of what you're up to professionally? And then from there, we can jump into the conversation.
I teach sociology, sociological theory at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. So I'm a sociologist and theorist.
Nice. And how, I guess one of the things that I'm always kind of curious about is how people get into what they're doing. Is there any way you can kind of describe how you got into sociology and the world of academia?
Yeah, I grew up in Montreal and I was a soccer player. And I lived in Scotland, tried to play pro soccer. And I got a soccer scholarship at Cleveland State University. And a friend of mine gave me a copy of Escape from Freedom. And that book just kind of made me more political. So I got involved in politics, something called the Democratic Socialists of America. It's a larger group now, but at that time it was a smaller group with Michael Harrington and Barbara Enright and Cornel West. So I was mostly involved in that. And then eventually I moved to New York City to move America to the left, to try and be an activist in the DSA, and enrolled in a sociology program. And I always knew a lot about Erich Fromm, so I made that my dissertation topic, why he became influential and why he became a forgotten intellectual. So
Oh, that's so fascinating, and I really want to kind of go there. But before we do that, so I'm just curious. When you first read Escape from Freedom, it wasn't necessarily for a class; it was just a friend kind of handing you the book.
yeah.
What did you think about some of his ideas, kind of at that stage in your life?
Oh, it
What were
just
some of the things that really hit you?
well, the person who gave the book, Vanier College, they have this thing called CEGEPs they're kind of like community colleges in Canada and Quebec, but they're really kind of intellectually interesting places. So that it was an American draft resistor, draft dodger, in a more prerogative way, but I would say draft resistor, who assigned the class. He was fleeing the Vietnam War and assigned the book in the class. My friend gave it to me. So it was sort of like, it was about freedom. It was about individualism. It was about an opposition to injustice. And the book was arguing for the defeat of Hitler. So it wasn't an anti-war book. It was actually arguing for entering into the war to defeat Hitler. But the sensibility was one of freedom and social justice and an anti-war. So the book made me a socialist, or a democratic socialist, and helped me think about my life. Kind of think about what I wanted to do with my life, to kind of do something with my life. Yeah, it was very.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, in terms of you kind of growing up, if we can go maybe just a little bit further back, in terms of like your family, some of the values that you grew up with, did you find that Fromm sort of brought those back out, or was it going against some of the things that you maybe grew up with?
Yeah, I think it was sort of like taking some of the things that I grew up with and sort of taking them to another level. So I was born in Glasgow, Scotland,
Oh,
and from
wow.
Irish family who their ancestors had come from Donegal in Ireland, in Ireland, and my favorite soccer team was Glasgow Celtic. It's kind of like a left wing, you know. So my father was a Labor Party voter, and but not a radical other than that. So it was kind of taking some of the social democratic and left values and kind of some of the elements of Catholicism, I think, but radicalizing them and taking them in a more in a more individualistic and a more sustained intellectual way. It also made me an intellectual. All the things that he cited and talked about, I wanted to go and read them, and so
Got you.
I didn't have an intellectual background. I didn't have so my dad worked in the airlines as a machinist for Air Canada for years. So it wasn't. It introduced me to the world of the intellectual more than reflected my my upbringing.
Okay, beautiful. Now, going forward to kind of graduate school, and you said you did your dissertation on how Erich Fromm emerged into this person that was very well known, and then exploring maybe his decline or how he, in some ways, became forgotten. Could you trace that out a little bit? Like what's some of the research that you did there?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I noticed, maybe before I get to what I published out of it, is sort of the inspiration. What I noticed is that in the Democratic Socialism America, this left-wing group in the U.S., I knew so many people who had become socialists by reading Erich Fromm, like it happened to me. But as I became more of an activist in the center of the organization, at one point I was the national chair of the Democratic Socialism America Youth Section. So I knew the leadership at kind of the national level. But those people, they didn't really follow Erich Fromm. They tended to dismiss him. So he seemed to have an influence in bringing people into the movement. But in the leadership, his influence dropped off. And I noticed the same thing in sociology, that I knew a lot of people who became sociologists because they read Erich Fromm. But in the top journals or the top universities, people dismissed him as a simplistic thinker, not really a sociologist. So I saw this sort of pattern.
Interesting.
So that's what I wrote my dissertation on, how to become. There's a famous American, or it's actually, she's Canadian, but she teaches at Harvard, called Michelle Lamont, and she wrote a famous article called How to Become a Dominant French Philosopher, the Case of Jacques Derrida. So I flipped that around and said, that's how you become a famous philosopher. How do you become a forgotten intellectual? How do you have a reputation and then lose it? And then what does that tell us about how boundaries between fields are constituted and how the intellectual world works? So that's what I wrote about. I kind of wrote a bunch of articles, a series of articles that got me tenure, that was on his relationship to psychoanalysis, his relationship to the Frankfurt School, his relationship to the political left, and wrote a whole series of ones. But the most important one is How to Become a Forgotten Intellectual, the Case of Erich Fromm.
Got you. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of different threads we could follow, and it's a kind of a complicated kind of reality, but is there any way you could maybe highlight some of the major points in terms of how he got forgotten?
I would say there's four things, really.
Okay.
The first thing is he was a Marxist who popularized Marx in the United States. No one did more to popularize Marx in the United States than Erich Fromm in the 40s and 50s. And so conservatives and liberal Cold War intellectuals hated Fromm, but that created a controversy. But Orthodox Marxists who supported Stalinism hated Fromm even more than the conservatives. So he kind of got it from both sides. That's one piece of the story. The second piece of the story is he was a Freudian. Probably no one other than Freud and maybe Erik Erikson did as much to popularize Freud in the United States. So anyone who disliked Freud disliked Fromm, but the controversy helped create his reputation. But the Orthodox Freudians hated Fromm even more than the anti-Freudians did, because he was challenging some key orthodoxies. In Marx, he challenged Stalinism. In Freud, he challenged Orthodox libido theory, the Oedipal complex. So those are the two key things. I would say when you look at how institutions of knowledge get constituted in disciplines, he also got caught between the disciplines. So he wasn't really a psychologist, he wasn't really a social psychologist, and he wasn't really a sociologist. So that being in between created influence, because he was putting things together that hadn't been put together. But over time, there was nobody there willing to promote his ideas with the institutional prestige of a discipline. But the fourth thing, this is really the key thing, he did all this, being a Freudian, anti-Marxist, Marxist, or anti-Stalinist Marxist, and a kind of interdisciplinary scholar. He did all this to mass public, writing as a public intellectual, not as a specialized academic scholar. So writing to the public got him famous, but it also created envy and criticism from intellectual elites and academic elites, and they ultimately attacked his reputation over a period of time, and that's what you get. a once famous intellectual who's still popular among the public, but the intellectual elite dismiss him. That's the story of Erich Fromm, I would say.
Gotcha. That's great. I've actually wondered, one of the things that's drawn me to him lately is just how clear he is, and his writing style is just so digestible. I've wondered if that kind of worked against him in more academic, intellectual circles, if they critiqued him for that.
I mean, I think that's key. That's why I loved him so much. And in the early years of my becoming an intellectual of sorts myself, is like I go, oh wow, I can understand that. I mean, it's complicated. I got to spend some time on this, and maybe I should go read some more stuff. But I could basically understand this, and it spoke to me, and it made sense. As I went up the academic hierarchy, I realized that a lot of people were making academic reputations on the opposite, and saying, telling people what they already know in language that they can't understand.
Yeah.
And Fromm was doing the opposite. He was telling us something that we sort of knew but couldn't really see or didn't really get, but in a language we could understand. And I think that's key. And that's what led me to, why I'm interested in the comparison between Fromm and Peterson, because I've worked this out all with the Fromm case. But I do think that's true. I think there is an institutional bias against clear writing in the academy and among elite intellectuals.
Yeah, no, I could totally see that, and I know it's tough. At least for the common person, I would see that as a bit of a shame. But I could see how that dynamic would play out in academic circles.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a terrible shame, and that is part of the thing. Is that sometimes, and this is where I don't think we want to make Fromm into a hero, because
Right.
he was very influential. He makes mistakes. He says things that are wrong, or in retrospect, you say that's not right. But he said it so clearly that it's obvious that it's wrong. And some of the academics, I think, like the Adorno and say Marcuse, they say things in such an abstract way that you have generations of grad students sitting around trying to figure out what they're really seeing, and sometimes not seeing that there's just some mistakes there or some biases. So I agree. I think that's a shame, but I think intellectuals and academics need to push forward and emphasize clear writing, clear communication, and then ultimately it's a democratic intellectual, not an aristocratic elitist or experts telling people what they need to think.
I love that, Neil. Man, that resonates with me quite a bit. Yeah. Now, I know one of the things that you have said in one of the interviews that I listened kind of in preparation for this conversation is that maybe one of the downsides of Fromm becoming more popular and almost even famous through some of his popular writings is he didn't do as much like peer-reviewed stuff, and maybe he started quoting himself a little bit too much. I wonder if you could kind of speak to that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think, you think about, there's a public intellectual. The phrase comes from Russell Jacoby, who was an American historian who wrote about the fall of the public intellectual and the rise of the expert. And that phrase comes from Jacoby. But there's also something called, this comes from Louis Koser, a very important sociologist who was very influential on me when I was young at Dissent magazine. But he coined the phrase the celebrity intellectual. And so when a public intellectual becomes so famous, there's a dynamic of the celebrity process that I think allows you to reach a bigger audience, but you basically are not, you're not surrounded. There's a tendency that you're not surrounded by people who are telling you that's wrong or surrounded by other academics or scholars who are equals, because
Gotcha.
you can bypass the peer review process, or even the critique of other intellectuals, not through academic peer review, but for intellectual journals. You can kind of bypass it. So I do think there's a tendency for famous celebrity intellectuals to get a bit lazy, to to rehash kind of core arguments, and maybe kind of become too self-referential. And I think some of that happened with Fromm. He pulled back from that near the end of his life, and he wrote The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness and Social Character in a Mexican Village. So he entered back into sort of trying to do high level work, consulting and engaging with other intellectuals of the same stature. But there's a tendency, I think.
Okay, toward that. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I know in a moment I want to kind of jump into thinking about Fromm and then Jordan Peterson, who I never would have put together, but I just really love some of the things you do with that. I guess just maybe one last question about Fromm that I have is, and I think it will connect to the Peterson thing too. Didn't he, throughout his career, also serve as a psychoanalyst? He was actually working with people as well as doing his writing.
Yeah, and I mean, and that is part of the story, right? It's sort of
Right.
the creativity of Fromm came from putting together things from different fields. So he was primarily a psychoanalyst. That's what he did for a living. He did a PhD in sociology with Max Weber's younger brother, Alfred Weber. So he had a PhD in sociology, but he essentially became a clinical psychoanalyst. That's what his passion was, and his career was. And he played a role in psychoanalytic institutes, in Berlin and then in the United States. So that's what he would do that's what he would do in the morning, and in the afternoon he would write. That kind of so he was combining and combining the psychoanalytic insights that he got from working with patients with the broad reading that you would get from being a public intellectual or a sociologist. That was creative, and that created new ideas. But it's also difficult to sustain, right?
Mm,
Because he was a little bit stretched too thin, and people would object to taking psychoanalytic ideas into sociology, or taking sociological ideas into psychoanalysis.
got you. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so Neil, I think now is a pretty good time to just kind of jump into, kind of the Fromm Peterson connections and ways that they kind of diverge. I guess I want to start by asking you, like, how did you get into doing sociological research on Jordan Peterson?
Yeah, well, I think that this model that I had of kind of different fields, being a psychoanalyst, a sociologist, kind of a public intellectual, a
Sure.
celebrity intellectual, that was a pretty developed model that it came out of the Fromm case. And I studied David Riesman, and I studied Noam Chomsky, and I studied other intellectuals. So I had had a framework. And then, I am of the Democratic left, but one of the things I liked about Fromm is and the dissertation was called Escape from Orthodoxy instead of
Oh, that's
Escape from
great.
Truth. So Fromm was willing to challenge orthodoxies. So I am of the left, but I'm sort of drawn to left-wing intellectuals who challenge orthodoxies on their own side. So
I
that
like
was sort
that.
of the framework that I had. And then at McMaster University, and so I used to run a salon in my apartment in downtown Toronto, where I'd have academics and non-academics come, and just in my living room we would talk ideas, sort of trying to break out of like academic seminars or
Oh, that's
status
wonderful.
hierarchies. And so I had somebody, a Canadian journalist, in my salon the day that Jordan Peterson was canceled at McMaster University. At my university, he was giving a talk, and the students protested and prevented him from speaking. His wife took a video of him outside where he was basically deplatformed. People were yelling and calling him names. So he went out into the lawn outside and continued with his talk. And that was the beginning of this rise to fame. That was at the very beginning of this. So I was looking at this and going, well, I think in political terms, I think that this is the serious mistake, tactical error to deplatform someone. And he's someone politically, I politically disagree with Jordan Peterson on, especially recently, I always did, but especially recently, but I disagree with him politically. I have intellectual differences with him. I am not a Jordan Peterson, accolade in political intellectual terms, but I just thought that was a mistake. And also, I think that I rejected this idea that he was wrong about everything. We should just shut him down, and he's wrong about everything. So I started to watch that, and then because of this framework that I had already worked out with Erich Fromm, I started to see some of the obvious parallels. Fromm was a psychoanalyst, practicing psychoanalyst. Peterson was a clinical psychologist. They were really interested in authoritarianism. So Fromm famously wrote about the authoritarianism of the left, right? He was part of that Adorno authoritarian personality research tradition. He helped create that before Adorno, but he insisted that there was an authoritarianism of the left. Peterson was suggesting the same thing. Fromm wrote a famous self-help book, The Art of Loving. Peterson wrote, 12 Rules for Life. They were both kind of, they were Freudians, but Fromm was anti-Jungian, but Fromm was really interested in religion and spirituality,
right?
Interested in Buddhism, just like Peterson was. They were basically they were leftist in their youth. Peterson was in the NDP, early in his life, but they're sort of political, but not really like party people. Neither of them are really like a party person. Fromm was involved in the Socialist Party, but I was really involved in the Socialist Party, or the Democratic Socialist Mirror. I was kind of really, like, my whole life for a decade was in that. So some people who study Fromm say, well, he was involved in the Socialist Party, and he was, but he was kind of on the margins of it. And it's a similar kind of relationship that Peterson has to the right. He's involved in the right, and he's getting more involved in it, but it's more they use him than he's famous. He's sort of a resource for the right. And that was the same kind of thing that happened with Fromm, that the socialist movement would use Fromm because he was famous. He would bring people in. So there's a lot of parallels. So I just started to think about those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One quick question I did have about Peterson from your sociological perspective is, do you feel like recently he's gotten even more right or involved in certain things that's making him even more extreme?
Well, my model about Peterson is that there's 8 sociological roles that he plays. So he's an academic, he's a therapist, he's an entrepreneur, he's a father figure, he's a spiritual leader, he's an innovator in media, he's a political intellectual, and he's a celebrity. And he does all of those 8 things. And that's the source of the controversy and the fame. And also it creates chaos in his life, right? So, but if you take these 2 roles, the academic and the clinician, those are the roles that keep him a bit more grounded. So even today, if you watch, I saw him in Budapest. I went to see him. I'm doing research on George Soros and conspiracy theories. So I was in Budapest and I went to one of his big talks, and he's not that right wing when he talks to the readers of Beyond Order. When he goes into the clinical role or the father figure, he's not that right wing at all. He's actually quite engaged with the people's personal problems and kind of compassionate, kind in a way. And when he's an academic, he's not that right wing because he's engaged with the empirical literature, and talking about neurosciences and various things. So those two roles, the clinician and the academic, they kept him grounded. When people deplatformed him at the university and drove him out of the clinical role, those two pillars were taken away. And so I think what you see is, in response to the attacks and some of his own choices and personal troubles. I don't think it helped being in Moscow, and the whole mental health, it wasn't improved by that. But he's basically kind of gone to the people who supported him, and he's become more explicitly right wing. And I think he's going, unhinged almost sometimes, and ungrounded. But that's my sociological analysis of that. Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, that's I feel like that's really helpful because I just have so many questions about all this. But one, I guess, for Peterson, and just a little bit of background on me. In a lot of my clinical work, I end up working with like young adult males who I think are really looking for a father figure, and they turn to his writing and a few others to, I think, find that. I think they're doing it unconsciously, but I wonder if you could just kind of speak to that dimension of his role is as father figure. Like, how do you understand that? How did that happen? What does that mean? I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the Fromm thing, like Fromm taught in universities. He taught a little bit, but he was never really like a real professor. He kind of like taught part-time. And if you think about Peterson as a professor, that class that he did, the Maps of Meaning class, I mean, universities are not organized around giving advice and role models for life. They're organized around academic debates. And a lot of young people are, you get exposed to the literature and the review and my research agenda. And a lot of professors are just wrapped up in their research agenda. They're not really that interested in students, right? That's how the university is organized. So Peterson was different from the very beginning, the Maps of Meaning class. It's a class where he was basically talking directly, and Fromm did the same thing. He would talk directly to people and say, here's the path for living a good life. That's a different role from what academics do. So he was doing that from the very beginning, Peterson was. And I think that when you could take us into the stage as innovator, doing it on YouTube and Twitter and things, but especially YouTube, where you have a chance of having a longer conversation, I think that, I think he's talking. The way I see it is, what's wrong with the universities, or what's wrong with our society, that we're not providing the guidance that Peterson is. That's what I see it that way. There's a kind of a vacuum. I think a lot of young people want to talk about. There's a crisis of masculinity. There's not a focus on some of the, and I think sometimes academics even dismiss it. You saw it in the way that people reacted to Peterson. And I don't agree with some of the things he says, and this is a complicated conversation about young men. But the idea that you would attack somebody because he has a big audience of young men, that seems to me kind of bizarre. I mean, shouldn't we be going, okay, that's great. What is he offering these young men? What do they need? What's wrong with the society that people feel without a mooring?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the similarities I see between Fromm and Peterson is how directly they address like our fundamental existential needs.
Yes, I agree.
I think that's one of the draws for both of them. Even though I think they come to maybe different conclusions and they look at it from different perspectives, I think they really are focusing on those existential needs, and I just think that's so important.
Fromm talks all about Dostoevsky, and he's very influenced by Nietzsche, and so so absolutely that they're very, very similar. They're dealing with these existential crises of what it means to be human. Cornel West does this too, sort of like, what does it mean to be human? Universities don't do that, as much as they should, and the rest of the society, social media and corporate world, they're interested in selling people things to profit from human needs. They're not really kind of focused on getting at these core human needs or using human needs. So there's a big vacuum. And I think that, yeah, a lot of people are going, well, he's successful in holding together a family, raised a family. It's very hard to do that now. Some young people in buying a house.
Oh
So,
yeah.
it makes sense that people might find that appealing, and
Sure.
he takes on the role. He's willing to step in and give advice.
Oh yeah, no, completely. Now let me ask you this. So I know there's tons of differences in their actual views on things, but I think you have some interesting ways to talk about in their kind of rise to fame. What are some of the differences that you saw between Fromm and Peterson from a sociological perspective?
I mean, if you think about it, like, the first thing is, there's a very interesting book called The Seeds of the 60s. It's a sort of an intellectual history of books and ideas that created the social protests of the 1960s. And Fromm is a key figure in that, in helping create. He had an influence on Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. He had an influence on the anti-Vietnam War movement. He was influential in socialism and human rights campaigns. He still gets Amnesty International still gets $100,000 of royalties from Fromm's books. Fromm donated his royalties to Amnesty International. He helped fund them in
Oh,
the early years. He helped create a kind of an ecological consciousness, and he had a certain kind of proto feminism, and opposed the Vietnam War very prominently. So he was one, and his whole focus on critiquing conformity was part of the 1950s that led to the 60s, a kind of a critique of the alienation of the 50s. So Fromm's ideas helped create, to the extent that ideas and intellectuals create movements. Movements create ideas. Ideas create movements. It's not as simplistic as Fromm created the 60s, but Fromm
sure.
had an influence on the 1960s. And Jordan Peterson's ideas are a response to the 60s, a critique of the 60s. That we've gone too far. There's too much individualism, too much sexual freedom, right? I mean, he's sort of
No, it's such a good point.
yeah, yeah. It's a kind of now. So that's one thing. It's sort of like I would say also that, this is why I think that the Fromm Peterson, if I had to say the core thing about why the Fromm Peterson comparison is so interesting and so important. The other thing that they're different about is that, but if you have to put in sort of like the orthodox left into the picture. So many of the orthodox left are basically saying it's all about structures. You need to
Mm.
change the structures. Some people would joke about sort of how many sociologists does it take to screw in a light bulb? None, because the light bulb doesn't need changing. It's society and it's social structure. So the whole kind of, that sort of thing is very dominant. And
Sure.
conservatives flip it around and say, you got to focus on yourself, clean your room, right?
Right.
So Fromm was unique, and he's basically saying you got to clean your room and you have to change the structures of society. You
I
need to
love
do
that.
both. And so that's why I think Peterson goes too far in the one direction, but he has an insight that the left has forgotten that I think we have to take up.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a great point. Now, didn't you also reflect on, in terms of their rise to fame, there's a difference in that from was it The Art of Loving that really put him on the map, or maybe it was Escape from Freedom. So it was like a book, it was ideas, whereas Peterson was less his books at first and more kind of the controversy
Yeah,
politically.
yeah. I mean, I think that Fromm became famous quite late in life. He was 41,
Mm.
where Escape from Freedom. So he wrote Escape from Freedom. He had this book called in 1941, and he was reviewed in the New York Times and reviewed in all the top sociology journals. He wrote a book called Man for Himself in
Oh yeah, it's a great
1947.
book.
Yeah, that also got reviewed in the Times. He was very influential. He influenced someone called David Riesman, who became the top sociologist of the time, the top public sociologist of the time. So, and the Sane Society was in 1955, and that also sold 7 million copies and was reviewed in the top sociology journals, and also in the Times and in the intellectual journals. So by the time he was 56, Fromm was at the height of his fame. And so it's quite different from Peterson. Peterson really kind of burst onto the scene at that period of his time of life in the mid 50s. Before that, sometimes left-wing intellectuals like to dismiss Peterson, his career a bit. I kind of reject that. I politically disagree with Peterson, very strongly. But I'm not going to make up stuff that he wasn't a successful psychologist. He got cited a lot. He knew a lot. He was, he was quite influential, but in a narrow academic field. So he wasn't a public. He tried. He was on the thing in Toronto. We have this thing called, in Ontario, we have a thing called The Agenda, which is a TV show, and he used to be a publicly funded TV show. So he did stuff, and he was, he really burst into fame, where Fromm, it was a longer process over decades. And when Fromm wrote The Art of Loving, he was at the height of his fame. And so The Art of Loving was the beginning of the decline, because that's when he started to be associated with self-help books, which are low status, right? This is where I think, this is one thing I really agree with Peterson and Fromm. I was just listening to a video of Peterson the other day, and he was basically saying, when he did practice, of course, he's been driven out of that and attacked by the College of Therapists and Psychologists in Ontario. But he would say when he was working with people, he would give them self-help books or encourage people to read self-help books. So he's not contemptuous of self-help books. Neither was Fromm. He wrote The Art of Loving. But a lot of academics are kind of contemptuous of self-help books. They sort of put it down. And so I think that's just a snobbery, and it's the difference between being a clinician and being an academic.
Oh yeah, no, totally. So do you think they just see self-help as reductionistic or not rooted in the contemporary scholarship and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. When really the purpose is or not new, like it's not like a new insight, right? But
I see.
Of course, because that's the logic of the academy. You have to come up with an original contribution that's innovative and new, right? And so, but the category of the self-help book, the evaluation you want to make of a self-help book is not as if it's new or innovative. It's whether it helps people. I mean, that's a whole different, it's a different way of judging it, right?
Sure. Now, okay, this is great. So, Neil, can you for a moment reflect on, I know Peterson ended up debating Slavoj Žižek.
Yeah.
And you've written a little bit about that. I'm just wondering kind of sociologically what you thought about that. And then I guess what I'm kind of curious about too is I wonder if we could, in terms of a thought experiment, explore, if Fromm and Peterson would be in a debate, what would that look like? What might they talk about? I'm just curious if you could explore that.
Yeah, when I had that salon I was telling you about in my apartment, we watched it in my apartment, the debate, because it was down the street from us in Toronto, right?
Yeah.
So we just watched it, and I had a number of young people who are Jordan Peterson supporters, and a number of young people who are grad students who are Zizek supporters. And we talked about it, in some ways Zizek has replaced Fromm as the public intellectual psychologist, the leftist public intellectual psychologist who's famous, right? He's sort of like the Fromm of today, right? But the thing about this is where the academic world that exists, that didn't exist when Fromm wrote, everything's become more academic and more arcane and more and Lacanian. So he's kind of like Fromm, but he doesn't talk in the clear way that Fromm does. So and that's also sort of like the celebrity culture has gotten even more extreme. So Fromm was famous, but he didn't play the celebrity role. And I think Zizek kind of likes to play the celebrity role. He kind of revels in it, right?
Sure.
So, I'm skeptical of Lacanian analysis, and I'm skeptical of some of the ideas that Zizek promotes, although sometimes he goes against left-wing orthodox ideas, and I think in a ways it's useful. But I would say that the Zizek model for the public intellectual is a move backwards, as opposed to something like Fromm that could, actually engage mass publics, not just grad students, right? It's kind of like he's a public
Right.
intellectual for grad students and professors and people in the, people in the art world, say, or kind of
Yeah.
film, right? I mean, that's not the other difference between Fromm and Peterson, I would say, if you think sociologically. And this is where I think Peterson has something useful to say that Frommians could learn from, because I would say that Fromm's base, the people who liked his books the most, were people who wanted to go into social work or psychology or sociology, or they were kind of going into the cultural fields or the white collar, professions. He didn't really speak to blue collar workers in the same way that he did. He had a base, he's involved in the Socialist Party, but it wasn't. I think Peterson does a better job of speaking to those populations. Sometimes with politics that I disagree with, that would be critical. But he sort of speaks to that, and he also speaks to students who are in the sciences and engineering, in a way that Fromm didn't. Fromm's base were people in humanities and the social sciences. That's sort of the 60s, right? The kind of that's sort of so I think that you can see the same thing in the Zizek-Peterson debate. It's sort of like Peterson speaking to grad students and people in humanities and the social sciences, and Peterson speaking to people in the sciences and kind of engineering students and kind of the more popular social classes. So I think that I think we got to get out of the Zizek Peterson debate. It's kind of like a celebrity. It was a bit of a circus in a way,
Right.
I mean, I think Zizek knows a lot more about Marx. He really kind of showed his superiority as a kind of a Marxist scholar. But but showing people your superiority as a Marxist scholar is not really the same thing as engaging in debates about public issues, and that's what I think we should move the discussion forward on that.
Yeah, that's great. Now, I know in your piece where you write about Peterson and Fromm, you kind of end with some suggestions for scholars, for thinkers on how we can learn from Fromm, or how to not how to go against Peterson, but how to maybe engage with him. I don't know if I want to say at his level, but what are some of your thoughts on how Fromm can inform how we move forward in terms of engaging some of these things?
Well, I mean, one thing, Fromm and Marcuse were critics. They had had a debate, and there's a number of people now who are interested in Fromm who used to be followers of Marcuse, and I think it's a good thing that the conflict between the critical theorists gets overcome, and people see that they have a lot more in common. But one of the things that Marcuse said that I really disagree with, and that Fromm never supported, was this notion of repressive tolerance. Marcuse argued that we should have free speech for the left and deplatforming. He didn't use the term deplatforming, but we should shut down people of the right. And this is, I think, a position that is quite prominent today, that people have a focus on shutting down opponents or showing that their opponents are motivated by bigotry and racism, and sometimes they are. But I think that the thing about Fromm is he stressed a positive politics, going out and talking to people, talking to mass publics. So I think that the issue is, can Fromm's ideas help us talk to people and figure out solutions to the problems that Peterson is speaking to in a better way? That's sort of
so much.
It's not so much that Fromm's smarter than Peterson. The question is, can a Frommian influenced perspective help us think about this crisis of masculinity, say? Can Fromm's ideas help us think about the crisis of the universities. If you look at the universities, I mean, I have trouble. I have some very good students, and McMaster is a good university, but there's a lot of students I can't get them to read the syllabus. Never mind
Mm.
the books. And Peterson is actually creating, an upsurge in reading, right? And people are reading Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and these long form podcasts that you're doing. Some of it here. I mean, this is where he's an innovator. I mean, the universities need to innovate and think about new ways of engaging with ideas. And so we can do the innovation, but we got to get to the actual content, not closing out people we don't like Peterson.
Yeah, no, totally. You reflected a bit on your article on how when he had his crisis with anxiety and was hospitalized, that people were almost wishing his death and saying all these things online, like his opponents. I wonder if you could speak to that. I see so much of that on social media, and when you disagree with someone, just almost forgetting their humanity.
Yeah, I think I was appalled at that. I mean, people were almost just wishing that he would die almost. And I mean, the man has a family, and he has
Right.
and he's not a Nazi. Come on. I disagree with him fundamentally. And
I do
especially
too.
recently, he's going more to the right. And I disagree with him even stronger. But to wish him ill in that way, or to also to make up stuff, that the criticisms are not always that accurate. There are real, and then maybe that's where the Fromm comparison can be helpful. Let's get at the real issues. Young versus Fromm versus Peterson. How do we think of psychology? What is the crisis of work? What is the
Mhm.
crisis of the university? How can Fromm or Peterson help us think about it? And other thinkers, So
Absolutely.
we have to get to the content, not the. And you look weak when you're basically, and people are suspicious when you're basically saying, don't listen to that person. Right? People go, well, I'm going to go listen to that person.
Now I'm gonna go listen to him. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's totally understandable.
Oh yeah. Okay, so Neil, can you tell us a little bit more when you talk about this salon? I don't know if you still run it, but I'm now just really curious about how that started, and then I'm curious if it's a manifestation of some of the things we've been talking about in terms of, it sounds like maybe you were bringing together people that had different views or not everyone had to agree. I
Yeah.
wonder if that could be a bit of a microcosm for what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I got the idea from the Sane Society. If you go look at Fromm's 1955, the Sane Society, he basically says, and this is where I think he was right. I mean, he didn't see the internet, but he saw kind of new technologies, and he knew that they would be places where people could be manipulated. And so his argument was that you needed to create small communities of democratic communities of discussion, and that you
Mm,
had to have these small, kind of like American small town debates, and so grassroots kind of the democracy, deliberative democracy at the grassroots. So I was influenced by that. So that's what
okay.
I thought, and I do think that's one of the things that's happened. I'm quite influenced by Jonathan Haidt and his Heterodox organization. He's a psychologist, social psychologist at NYU, and I do think it is true that universities, there used to be, I mean, in the 30s, there were a lot of Nazi doctors and professors and students. So it's not true that universities were always left wing. If you were Marxist, you couldn't be in the universities in Germany, but during the Nazi period. But today's university is more and more liberal and left dominated, and I do think that creates a kind of an echo chamber. And it's one
Mm,
of the things that's different about Fromm. Fromm would engage with conservative thinkers, and he worked with David Riesman, who was a very prominent American liberal. So from the very beginning, Fromm was encouraging us to talk to, think with, and engage with conservatives, liberals across political camps. He maintained his democratic socialist, radical humanist. Kieran Durkin has a terrific analysis of radical humanism in
yeah, I'm
Fromm.
reading that book now. It's so good.
It's a terrific book, and so, but Fromm was always engaging with conservatives, and he's actually sort of like looking at, you know, traditional conservatives. I mean, conservative, aristocratic thinkers, right? And obviously, there's some problems with that kind of anti-democracy, and we have a gender
Sure.
and race frame, and colonial frame. All this important stuff needs to be, picked up and engaged with. But there's still a principle of engaging with people across political camps. So that was a big. So the salon for me was like putting together this Frommian idea of small town discussions, but also an opposition to hyper professional discourse. So
Okay.
when people came to speak at the salon, I said no theory, no method, talk about the issues, no introductions with how famous you are, and I had a lot of quite well known people, but I didn't go all
Okay.
along. I really just tried to discourage credential card playing, that
Got
listen to
you.
me because, and then because it was done that way, I would go out of my way to have conservatives come and people who I knew who were more moderate or conservative, and I think it was a better conversation. So yes, I
Mm.
think that we need to. I think Fromm's it's really the opposite of Marcuse, is sort of deplatform the right and conservatives and build a kind of a left. I would like to build the left, but in dialogue with people who are moderate and principled conservatives who believe in democracy and are not demagogues and Trumpian apologists for you know
Right. No, absolutely. I'm so in line with that. I'm so grateful that we've connected and that you're kind of helping me think about some of these ideas because it's very inspiring. I guess, Neil, I mean, I know we've talked about quite a few things. Is there anything else about your scholarship or Fromm or the Fromm Peterson connection that you've written about that you feel like maybe I've missed asking you about, or something you just want to highlight before we kind of come to an end?
No, I think that's with I think we got at the core thing. The core issue for me is Peterson's fame has something to do. We can talk about the 8 roles that I outlined. We can
Sure.
talk about the historical moment. We can talk about him as a person and his character and his charisma in a certain sense. All this is true, but ultimately, Fromm became famous because the issues that came on the table in the 1960s, Fromm spoke to them. And there are a whole bunch of issues that are being put on the table. I think the university is in crisis. There's a crisis of masculinity in young people. There's an alienation and a kind of spiritual vacuum. There's a whole range of economic and political crisis a crisis of democracy. And so the key issue is trying to figure out different answers to those crises and put them on the table and try and help people in their lives, not be dismissive of people who are trying to sort out their lives as you're doing in your clinical practice and as self-help book authors do and we all do in our own lives. So we have to kind of try and put these things together some way, and building off from, I think, can take us in that direction.
Absolutely. And that's so well said. Neil, thank you so much for your time. This has been amazing. I hope that we can continue to connect. And yeah, I'm inspired and I want to continue to think about these ideas.
Yeah, anytime. I really enjoyed some terrific conversations, and I really value the work that you're doing. So keep it up.
Thank you so much.